All right. All right. So we are here with the broker, Louise Potter. Hey, Louise, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I'm trying to stop this live from working. I don't know. There we go. All right. So let's talk about earnest money. This is
Oh,
like
my
one of the
favorite
biggest
topic.
questions you get, I'm sure.
It really is. I mean, I think Sarah and I talk about it so much, and the answer is always the same that I think we say it in our sleep. I really
Okay.
do. Hmm.
I also want to talk about non-refundable earnest money because that's something that we've started, like a lot of states do that already. And we're
Hmm.
starting to think about adding that to like some of our contracts to help getting them accepted. So
Okay.
do you want to give us just the background on like the state of Ohio contract and when we can return earnest money? And then we'll talk about non-refundable.
Well, according to state law, there's really only three ways we can return earnest money,
Okay.
period.
Okay.
And, I know in the Columbus contract, it's referenced in there, but this is state law. You can only return it at closing,
Okay.
if we have a successful closing.
Well, you're not
Uh,
returning it then, right? It's just getting
Well,
credited.
Well, not always. There are still plenty of markets where we actually physically hand the check back to the buyer. Buyer can endorse it and use it towards funds for closing or take it and go buy their curtains or whatever.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Okay.
but like Columbus is that way. Not
Okay.
There are only certain companies that do credit it towards the commission at closing. And we can do that, but we just have to have certain wording in the contract in order to do so.
Okay.
So, because it has to come from the trust account, which is separate from the general account for any brokerage. So you have to have paperwork showing that it's transferring between the two and it's okay, and everybody
Okay.
agrees to it.
That makes
So
sense. Okay.
that's why we don't necessarily do a lot of it because it's not pre-printed in our contract.
Okay.
But at closing, where
Okay.
we physically hand the check back by mutual release. So everybody has to agree to it in the mutual release. And the third way is by court order. So
Can I ask you something about mutual release?
sure.
Okay, so in the Cincinnati contract, and I think maybe even Kentucky, we do Kentucky too, but I know we're just talking about Ohio.
Hmm.
I thought that in the contract that part of it was that if let's say the buyer wanted to pull the contract during inspections for, let's say, whatever reason, like they didn't like the inspections,
Hmm.
why is it not automatically then returned? Why does it have to be mutual?
Well, because the state law says that.
Ew, why is it in the contract then?
Well, what it says in the contract is in accordance with Ohio law. So there's the loophole. It's in accordance with Ohio law. And so that's really the only three ways. And that's where earnest money gets sticky.
Yeah.
I would love legislation to make earnest money go away altogether, but that's not going to happen. I'm one small little speck in the, grain.
We got in a fight about that in our realtor fight club is, do we really need earnest money? And I was on your side and I said, we don't really need it because it's annoying. It doesn't really do anything except what it does do. Because the counter argument is it lets the buyers, it makes the buyers feel like more like they're putting money in. But the thing is like there's so many ways they can like get it back, but not really, because the seller has to agree. There's
only three ways. 3 ways we can return earnest money.
So let's say I have a buyer and the buyer wants to back out because they didn't like something in the inspection. They didn't, and the seller doesn't want to give it back.
Let's say you did a mutual release with the earnest money being released to the buyer. Seller didn't sign that. They sent you one with the earnest money being released to the seller. That puts it in contention.
Yeah.
Okay. So it has to stay in the trust account wherever it is. If it's in EXP's trust account or, in Coldwell Banker's trust account or wherever it has to be, that's where it has to stay until there's an agreement, until there's a court order, or 2 years have passed. If 2 years have passed and it's not in dispute, it's not in court being disputed, it can be returned to the buyer at that time.
So a lot of sellers and seller agents feel that the contract, at least the Cincinnati contract, is very heavy to protect the buyer. but really it's maybe not, because the seller doesn't have to agree.
Correct. Buyers and sellers don't have to agree. That's where countering and all of that comes in back and forth. Most contracts are weighted towards the buyer because the buyer generates the contract 9 times out of 10.
We need to talk about reverse offers next time. I'm going to put it on
we
our
do,
list.
because I've done those before and they're really kind of fun, and people don't think of that.
No, I love them.
More in like we did that in the dark days, when with the downturn in real estate, we did those more frequently. This market is a buyer's market.
Right.
So when it's a seller's market, or when it's excuse me, I'm going to go backwards. It's a seller's market right now.
Yeah.
It's a buyer's market. Sellers can go back to buyers with an offer.
Right. They can even do it now, really.
Oh, absolutely. If something doesn't come together and, you had a good offer and you were negotiating and you took something else and you really wish you'd taken the first one, the first one you had initially gotten, and the second one falls apart, there is nothing to stop the seller from going back to that first buyer with a reverse offer.
So they need to tune in a couple of weeks and we'll talk about it. But let's go back to earnest money.
Right.
Okay. So
we digress.
There's 3 ways for the buyer to get the earnest money back, but every one of those ways has to be mutual between the buyer and the seller.
Well, yeah, closing is mutual because everybody's going to closing.
Right.
The mutual release, court order is the third one. And that is, seller wants it, buyer wants it. It's a fairly big earnest money. The one side or the other feels very strongly that, they deserve it. They can go to small claims court.
Okay.
And file there.
Okay.
And if you get
like Judge Judy.
Yeah. If you do get that court order, then the earnest money can be given to the person in the order.
But I would say, like, most of the time it either there's a successful close or it's in the contract is like the stipulate, or where the buyer's getting out of it typically are the inspection or the appraisal or the financing contingency, correct?
Right. A contingency is not satisfied, and one of the rights of that contingency is the termination of that contingency, and then they can ask for the earnest money back.
Right.
But occasionally you do have people who don't agree with
because, like, I'm thinking, if I'm the seller, right? If I'm the seller and I had a buyer that wanted to buy the house and they say, well, we don't want to, they maybe tied up the house for a couple of days to do the inspections. And we all know that even if you put it pending, accepting backup, most people aren't going to show. I mean, maybe in this market people do, like, whatever, but like, let's just say you get you get many less offers and much less showings, right? So they've tied up the property for a couple of days. They do the inspection. They say they don't want it based on the inspection, but they won't give you the inspection. And you're thinking, as the seller, you're thinking, well, maybe they're just having buyer remorse. Maybe they found something else, like whatever. I don't want to give it back. Your agent is maybe pressuring you, saying, well, it is like, could be their right. It's in the contract that they're allowed to, like, request it back, right?
Right.
And they're pressuring you to, like, sign it to give it back. Maybe.
Well, the agent needs to be careful pressuring their client.
Yeah.
There's one thing to sit down and have a good discussion.
Yeah.
And say, here, this is what's in the contract. Here's what happened. I know in Columbus, the buyer is obligated to give the seller the copy of the inspection report. It says it right in the contract.
They're not in Cincinnati.
But in Columbus they are. So if they, here, if they don't give it.
Yeah, but even if you give a copy, it's not going to matter, right? Because one person's perception of, like, well, I don't want to deal with this, and the other person saying this is easy stuff, it doesn't matter. It's still the buyer's right to be like, this is not acceptable to me, right?
Absolutely. It could be, they found a termite. It could be
they found nothing. They always find something, but, like,
it just can't be for cosmetic purposes. It's
is that
not because
real?
they didn't like the paint color.
Okay.
But they certainly have that right, and that's exactly what the contract says. And they have the right to ask that earnest money back.
But the seller has the right not to give it.
Seller may not be right in refusing to give it. And, you can sit down and you can discuss. And I would probably at that point say, you might want to talk to an attorney about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
If they're not, if they don't want to, and it's not my job to beat them up to make them
Right.
return it. It's not my job even as the broker, because I know people sometimes want me as broker to call and say, oh, you've got to give that earnest money back.
Right.
That's not, that's not my role, and that's not our role as an agent. Our role is to counsel, to advise, not to beat somebody up. But then, if they aren't listening to reason, or you can't get where you need to go, then they should find out what the legal ramifications are.
Right.
So, and that's where an attorney comes in, because we're not attorneys.
No, we're not yet. Maybe one
No,
day, but not today.
We just play one on TV. But it is, it's frustrating, and that's why I hate earnest money, because it leads to more disputes in contracts than anything.
It's confusing. That's why it's very confusing. It makes no sense. It should be an agreement up front. And this is why I like how some states do non-refundable earnest money, because they have a refundable and non-refundable. And I'm thinking specifically of like North Carolina. So
you're not going to call it an earnest money then. You're only going to call it a deposit.
Okay. Oh, maybe. Yeah. Okay. A deposit. So they have the earnest money, and then they have an additional deposit. Is that
right?
Probably more accurate? Right. Okay. So it's like very clear. It's like when you hit certain points, there's a certain part that the buyer's doing their due diligence, and everybody agrees that they get their money back if the due diligence is not, if it's not satisfactory, and everybody's in agreement. But then at some point, it's like, well, this part is not, you don't get this part back. Like, you're giving this to me as a seller.
Well, we're seeing non-refundable deposits as a tool right now too, in our crazy trying to get, offers accepted.
I think it's a great idea, especially if it's not common in the market.
I think it does set you apart, very definitely. But if you're doing it, you need to do it correctly. Why? And write it correctly. And
job security for you.
So yeah, right. I'm secure. I'm good. Thank you.
All right. How do you do it correctly?
If I'm writing it, I'm going to give a $5,000 deposit, and I'm going to write it directly to the seller. And I'm going to give it to the seller within 48 hours of contract acceptance, or 48 hours of satisfactory inspection, or, whatever. I'm going to give it directly to the seller, because then we take the whole trust account issue out of the question. Okay. Who's going to hold it? How are you going to get it? Who's going to give it back? If it goes straight to the seller, it goes to the seller. I'm also going to probably say in my contract with my client's, guidance and approval, that that's going to be applied towards the buyer's funds at closing.
Right. Not like additional.
Not like an additional. No.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
I specifically mean it that way, because that's one of the things we have to be really careful when we're writing a contract, is to make sure it's complete.
Yeah. No, I like it. It's a good thought process. Well, I guess you have to ask the buyer, do you want this to be on top of what you're paying, or do you want it to be credited? But if you don't go through it, then they get to keep it. What is the intention with this extra money?
Right. This money says I'm very earnest about doing what I'm doing.
Right.
You see it a lot too when closing needs to get pushed out.
Yeah, I've seen it then.
If something happens, you'll see that, I want $1,000 non-refundable in order to do so.
Right.
And yeah, you can do that as well. But again, is that going to be applied towards the buyer costs at closing? Right. So,
just being clear about that.
Seller. Is it going to be certified funds? How is this going to be handled?
Right.
You got to answer the who, what, when, where, and why of those kinds of contingencies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like it. I mean, I think it does set you apart, but I think also too, not only asking those questions to yourself, but also, I lost my train of thought. It's been a long day, Louise, already.
I understand. Trust me.
I was thinking too, what is the amount, right? The amount needs to make sense. Have a thought process around, okay, if I'm taking this off the market, why would they choose my offer over somebody else's? And maybe it's because it's pays for one of the mortgage payments, or making the amount something that's realistic and makes sense, I guess.
Well, it should be relevant. It needs to be relevant. Are you covering somebody's costs for temporary housing?
Right.
And that's, that leads into a topic for another day, That is, contacting the listing agent before you even write the offer.
Oh my God, are we gonna have to talk about communication? That's a whole nother
Yeah,
video. That's
I
like a
know.
video series.
I know that could be a novel. It could be War and Peace.
Exactly.
Because it
Damn,
is War and Peace.
communication. It is communicate, period.
Pick up the phone and say what's
Verbally.
important to the seller so that we
Yes.
write an offer that makes sense.
Right.
And oh, by the way, we just wrote that offer and I sent it to you. Could you let me know
Did
you
get
got it?
Yeah.
And could you send me the residential property disclosure form or the lead-based paint?
Right.
Making yourself the very best co-op person that is good for communication only benefits your client because people like to work with you.
Exactly. No,
I got an offer from Jennifer. She's good. This is going to be a good offer. This person over here who wrote it using a crayon, I'm not sure, who they are or what they're doing. So let's really look at Jennifer's offer.
And see what's going on. No, I think being nice gets you like pretty far in life, right?
It does.
Not being a jerk. Okay, so I like this. Earnest money, it is touchy because I think it's misunderstood.
And it's interesting too, when you get clients from other states, that have a deposit of 10% of the purchase price, and you've got a $500,000 home. That's a chunk of change.
That's a lot. They need to understand like what,
when you're buying
that's worth fighting for.
$600,000 house and you're putting up $500, that's barely even a gesture. I mean, that's just that is chump change to walk away from. So,
I mean, mostly we're doing like approximately 1% or more on earnest money. And then if we end up doing like a non-refundable deposit, it is for some reason, like you had said before, finding out, making that call, finding out what the seller's situation is and being like, okay, well, we can cover that to ease the burden and to show you that we're serious and we want to move forward with this house unless something is truly wrong,
Right. Exactly. And all of it is with your client's direction,
Of course.
Here's our options. Well, sometimes we miss that too, and that becomes, I told my seller to do this and I did this and I did this. No, it's not I, it's they.
Yeah, they,
And
but they also look to us for guidance and for advice, right? Like this isn't necessarily something that everybody would think about. This is because we talk about it all the time and we're interacting with agents that do different things. But it's like, okay, well, here's exactly what you said. Here's some options. And then they can be like, tell me more about that one, how to, or whatever it is.
Yeah, Jennifer, I see 3 different things here in this scenario with our offer. We can do this, we can do this, we can do this. One of the things I see most frequently is this, but the choice is yours. What that says is, most of the world's doing this, so probably a good idea, but it allows them then to say, ooh, well, this one looks kind of appealing because of this, and you find out more about their situation.
Exactly.
You allow them to direct the show based on your counsel. That's what you want to do.
No, that makes sense. Well, I really appreciate you being on again. And I know everybody enjoys the clarity, even though it's kind of nice to like live your life in, what do they say? What's that expression? Ignorance is bliss.
Ignorance is bliss, yes.
Until you get in trouble.
That is the biggest pandemic I see, is ignorance is bliss.
Right, exactly. That's so funny.
I always like to say, you get that little funny feeling in the back of your mind where you think, ooh, this might not be right. We should be the first contact.
Agreed. And you're really easy to get a hold of. So
we try pretty hard to be as accessible as we can.
You're very accessible. Well, I really appreciate you being on. Thank you so much. If people have questions for you, how should they reach out to you? Just workplace.
They can reach out workplace chat is probably the best, and include both Sarah and myself, because you'll get a faster answer that way. Email is fine to the oh.broker@exprealty.net. That reaches the whole broker team, so you can get a faster answer. You're free to call us, you're free to text us, we watch it all.
It's crazy. And if anybody's outside of EXP that has a question, they can just contact me directly and I'll help. It's 513. I'll help direct them to you. 513.
Happy to help.
513-400-1691. All right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.